In the autumn of 1878, a farmer was plowing a dry creek bed in western Arkansas when his blade struck something solid. He assumed it was a root. Instead, it turned out to be a rifle, a Sharps carbine, military issue. Its stock blackened by an old fire, its barrel warped from heat, and wrapped in the decaying remnants of a cotton sack. Stitched along the inner seam of that sack, in rust-colored thread, were 11 names. 9 of those names had already appeared on federal death warrants filed at the Fort Smith courthouse, just across the state line. The remaining 2 had disappeared from every census, every tax roll, and every church ledger in the Indian Territory, as if the earth had simply opened and closed over them without a trace. That same afternoon, the farmer carried both the rifle and the sack into town and placed them on the desk of the federal marshal. Within 48 hours, the rifle was gone, the farmer's written statement was gone, and the name inscribed at the very bottom of the cotton sack, underlined 3 times in that same rust-colored thread, had vanished along with them. For nearly a century afterward, no serious historian would admit that name belonged to a woman. When the truth finally emerged, buried in the private letters of a court clerk opened by a descendant in 1962, it included a detail so disturbing that the Arkansas Historical Society, after 2 closed-door meetings and a formal vote, chose not to publish it. The file remains sealed to this day. Before we proceed with the story of the woman the Choctaw Roads came to call Nani, meaning sparrow, the only bounty hunter on the American frontier whose very name compelled outlaws to bury their weapons and flee toward the Mexican border. Please do me a small favor. Subscribe to this channel so you won't miss any of these forgotten stories. And in the comments, let me know what state, country, or city you're listening from right now. I am always amazed at how widely these stories travel, and I read every single comment. To grasp what this woman accomplished and why the records of her deeds are so deliberately fragmented, you must first understand the landscape in which she operated. The land between the Arkansas River and the Red River in the years following the Civil War was not a state. In any meaningful legal sense, it was not even America. It was the Indian Territory, a vast, unorganized expanse covering what is now eastern Oklahoma, set aside by treaty for the Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Creek, and Seminole nations after the forced removals of the 1830s. Since it was not a state, state law did not apply there. Tribal courts held jurisdiction only over their own citizens, meaning any man or woman who was neither a tribal member nor a federal soldier could commit murder in broad daylight on a creek road at noon and walk away untouched by any sheriff. Every outlaw, deserter, horse thief, counterfeiter, bigamist, arsonist, and runaway killer east of the Rocky Mountains understood this. They had known it since the war's end. By 1870, the territory had become the largest sanctuary for fugitives on the North American continent. A region of roughly 70,000 square miles, with a white criminal population estimated by the Federal Marshal's Office at more than 20,000 men. The only law that pursued these men was the United States Marshal Service, riding out of the federal court at Fort Smith, Arkansas, under a hanging judge named Isaac Parker. Over his 21-year tenure on the bench, Parker would sign the execution warrants of 79 men and preside over more than 13,000 trials. To enforce Parker's warrants across the territory, the marshals relied on a peculiar class of contracted riders called deputy marshals. About 200 of them at any given time, and beneath them, a rougher class still freelance bounty hunters paid per living body delivered to the Fort Smith jail and per corpse delivered with verifiable identification matching the warrant. The pay was $2 for an arrest, plus 10 cents a mile, plus a share of any reward, attached to the fugitive's specific warrant. Most bounty hunters in the territory were ex-Confederate cavalrymen down on their luck, Chickasaw freedmen who knew the backcountry, Cherokee veterans of the Union Indian Home Guard, still young enough to ride hard, or former outlaws who had cut deals with Parker's court to hunt their old partners for money. The average bounty hunter in that period lasted about 4 seasons before being killed or crippled. Almost none survived a full decade, and almost every single one of them was a man. The woman the Choctaw Roads came to call Nani did not fit any of those categories. She had been born into slavery in the Mississippi bottomlands around 1840. She escaped in the autumn of 1864 while Sherman's army was cutting through Georgia 600 miles to the east. She crossed the Mississippi River on a stolen flatboat in the winter of her freedom. By the spring of 1869, she was living alone in a one-room cabin on the border between the Choctaw Nation and the state of Arkansas, keeping a Sharps carbine across her knees, a pair of Remington Army revolvers in a flour sack beside her bed, and a leather cord around her neck with 7 small bone beads strung on it. How she got from a cotton field in Yazoo County to that cabin on that border, and what she did once she arrived, is the question this story attempts to answer. It is not a pleasant question, and the answer, as far as the records we still possess allow us to reconstruct it, is not a pleasant answer. Her name on the Carrick plantation ledger was Hester. No surname was recorded, because none of the Carrick people were given surnames in the plantation books. The plantation itself lay along a stretch of Yazoo River bottomland, about a day's ride northwest of Vicksburg, owned by a family named Carrick, whose patriarch, Thomas Carrick, had by the 1860 census brought the number of human beings he held in bondage to 163. Hester was 13 when she first appeared in the Carrick inventories as a field hand priced at $400. She was 24 when those inventories ceased to be kept. In the summer of 1864, they stopped being kept because Thomas Carrick himself had fled south to Alabama with his 2 unmarried daughters, a wagon of silver, and the plantation Bible, leaving behind an overseer named Abner Gassett, with full effective command of the property and the 156 human beings still on it. Abner Gassett was the kind of man whose reputation does not survive in the polite histories written by his grandchildren, but does survive vividly and in terrible detail in the work's progress, administration slave narratives collected by the Federal Writers Project in the 1930s. 3 different former Carrick people, interviewed independently in 3 different states over 2 years, described Abner Gassett in nearly identical terms. He was a small man, no more than 5'6", with pale red hair thinning on top, pale red eyelashes, skin that burned easily in the sun, and a habit of smiling, a quiet, almost patient smile, when he gave orders that would cause suffering. He kept a pack of 6 dogs, trained from puppies to catch runaways, and he had taught the lead dog to hold a grown man at the throat without closing its jaws. He kept a leather-handled braided whip he had named, without apparent blasphemy, the preacher, and used it with what one interviewed woman called a terrible patient steadiness, as if he were reading a sermon out loud 1 verse at a time. He also kept a ledger separate from the plantation books, in which he recorded the punishments he had administered and the names of those he had, in his own phrase, corrected. Hester's name appeared in that ledger more than any other. We know this not from the ledger itself, which was burned sometime in 1865, but from the testimony of a woman named Roa Green, Hester's half-sister through their shared mother. In the spring of 1937, at age 91, Roa sat on the back porch of her granddaughter's house in Memphis, Tennessee, and talked for 4 hours into the microphone of a WPA interviewer named Lemuel Cross. The interviewer's typed transcript, now held in the Library of Congress, runs to 47 pages. 41 of those pages are about Abner Gossett. The other 6 are about what Hester did on the night she left. It was the second week of September 1864. The cotton was in. The war was 16 months from its end, though no one on the Yazoo River knew that yet. That afternoon, Gossett had ordered 3 men flogged publicly in the yard for stealing corn from the corn crib. By nightfall, the 3 men had been locked inside the crib itself, a stone-walled, windowless building with a single heavy door, no water, and no treatment for the wounds on their backs. One of the 3 was Hester's younger brother, a young man of about 19, whose given name in the plantation ledger is recorded only as Cass. According to Roa Green, the moon that night was near full, but heavy cloud cover moved in from the southwest, and Hester waited without speaking, without eating supper, without lying down on her pallet, until the cloud bank finally crossed the moon's face a little before 2 in the morning. Then she stood up. She took off her shoes because they made noise on the boards. Barefoot, carrying nothing in her hands, she walked across the plantation yard and through the kitchen garden to the side door of the main house, where Abner Gossett slept alone in a ground-floor bedroom. His wife had left him 3 years earlier and gone back to her mother's people in Tennessee. She did not speak. She did not scream. According to Roa Green, she did not even breathe hard. What she did to Abner Gossett in the next several minutes, and with what instrument? The WPA interviewer, Lemuel Cross, declined to transcribe fully. The transcript at that point contains only a single notation in Cross's handwriting. Subject became distressed. Conversation paused 14 minutes. Then a single resumed sentence in Roa Green's own voices. She left him where he could be found, but not where he could be helped. Hester then walked back across the yard to the corn crib, broke the iron hasp of the lock with the long iron bar Gossett himself had used earlier that day to bar the door, carried her brother out on her back because he could no longer walk or stand, and laid him gently under a pecan tree on the edge of the yard, where a woman named Delia was already waiting in the dark with a stoneware jug of sweet water and a poultice of chewed tobacco leaves and lard for the wounds on his back. Hester did not stay. She did not even kiss her brother goodbye. She took Gossett's revolver, his boots, and his thoroughbred horse from the stable, and rode north through the cane. By first light, she was in the Yazoo swamp. By the following night, she had reached the Union Army picket line outside Vicksburg, where a young corporal in the 47th Illinois Volunteer Infantry later wrote to his wife that a colored woman on a fine thoroughbred horse came walking out of the cane at dusk with a pistol stuck in her belt, and the calmest face he had ever seen in his life. The woman, the corporal wrote, said her name was Hester, that she was 24, that she was not going back, and that she would not say goodbye to her brother, because she was afraid that if she did, she would not be able to leave. The corporal's letter, preserved today in the Illinois State Historical Library in Springfield, is the first document in the United States of America in which Hester appears as a free woman. It is also the last document in which she appears under that name. From the Vicksburg picket line, she moved north with Union supply trains, working her passage in exchange for food and a place to sleep. By the winter of 1865, she had reached the river depot town of Cairo, Illinois, at the confluence of the Ohio and Mississippi rivers. There she worked as a laundress in a boarding house catering to Union officers. And there, according to 2 separate references in the quartermaster records of the 13th Army Corps, Now at the National Archives in Washington. She also served unpaid as a tracker and scout attached to a Union cavalry detachment under Captain Winthrop Hale. Captain Hale was a veteran, a Dartmouth graduate, and a diarist. He kept a daily journal from the war's outbreak until his death in 1888. His diaries, recovered in 1951 from his family estate in Vermont and donated to the University of Vermont, contain only 3 entries that mention Hester. In the first, dated February 11, 1865, Hale writes that the colored woman H brought in 2 deserters from the 27th Missouri before sundown without assistance, without firing her weapon, and asked for no payment of any kind, only a pair of army issue boots in her own size, which he provided. In the second entry, dated March 3, 1865, he writes a single sentence. She can read sign the way a Methodist reads scripture. In the third and final entry, dated April 19, 1865, 5 days after Lincoln's assassination and 10 days after Lee's surrender at Appomattox, Hale writes at length, H had come to him at dawn, already dressed for the road with her horse saddled, and asked to be formally released from whatever informal service she still rendered to the army. He asked where she intended to go. She told him in words he quotes directly, that she was going to find the man Gusset, whom she had left at Carrick the previous September, and who she had only learned the week before from a freedman passing through Cairo, had not died of his wounds. He had been found by a Confederate field doctor on the road out of Vicksburg, nursed slowly back from the edge of death over the winter of 1864-65, and had since joined a Confederate guerrilla band operating in the borderland between southern Arkansas and the Indian Territory under a false name. Hale wrote that he tried for the better part of an hour to talk her out of it. He reminded her that the war was ending, that the country was exhausted, that a colored woman riding alone into that country would have no law to protect her, no friend to bury her, no witness to speak her name. She had not argued, not raised her voice, simply listened until he finished, thanked him for the boots and the use of his horse, and walked out of his tent into the cold gray light. He never saw her again. That brings us, by the long way, to the Indian Territory and to the 5 years of her life between the spring of 1869 and the autumn of 1874, about which we know simultaneously the most and the least, and by a considerable margin, the most disturbing things. Between those dates, a woman answering her description appeared and reappeared in the court records of Fort Smith, always at a distance, never directly. She never testified in open court, never signed her own name to any document, never accepted payment in person from any federal officer. She collected her bounties entirely through an intermediary, a Choctaw freedman named Isham Folsom, who had fought in the Union Indian Home Guard during the war and by the late 1860s had settled on a small farm at Scullyville, earning a quiet supplementary income as her banker and go-between with the marshals. The court clerk's ledgers record that in those 5 years, bounty payments totaling $4,016 on warrant to 7 were paid to Isham Folsom on warrant served by, in the clerk's consistent phrasing of then 30 separate known as Dacry entries. The colored of the Master known as Nani had roughly an enormous sum for the period, roughly a lifetime earnings of a skilled tradesman. It represented the capture or killing of at least 31 federal fugitives. She operated alone, without partner or posse, without backup of any kind. She rode a succession of horses, never keeping the same animal for more than a season, because she knew that a horse was the first thing an outlaw would recognize on a road. She wore, according to 3 surviving eyewitness accounts, a long man's wool coat dyed black with walnut hulls to kill the shine, a wide, brimmed black felt hat pulled low, heavy broken-in boots, and around her neck under the coat, A thin leather cord hung with 7 small notched bone beads. No one ever saw her without that cord. The beads, whispered the outlaws of the territory, were one for each of the 7 men she was still hunting. She did not take the men she was not hunting, turning them in alive when she could. Significantly more often than the men of her trade, accepting the lower bounty, rather than delivering a corpse. But when it came to one of the 7, she did not bring him in alive. She did not bring him in at all. When she found one of the 7, the body was never seen again. The horse would walk into a settlement days later, the cabin undisturbed, the trail in the dirt simply ending, and a single filed bone bead would be left somewhere at the scene, smooth and pale against the dark ground. The first of the 7 to be crossed off her list was a Missouri guerrilla named Jubal Creech, who had ridden with Quantrill's raiders during the war, been at the Lawrence Massacre of 1863, according to 2 sworn depositions, and afterward joined the same Arkansas Indian Territory brush band as Abner Gussett. In the summer of 1865, Creech was not found. Rather, he was not found in the spring of 1870, on the Pine Mountain Trail north of the Kiamichi River. His horse walked into a Choctaw settlement 3 days later, saddlebags still tied, rifle still in the scabbard, a full canteen at the pommel, and a single-filed bone bead wedged into the stitching of the saddle. The Choctaw light horseman who examined the horse said the bead was a message, though they would not say to whom or from whom or what it meant. The second of the 7 was a Cherokee freedman turned horse thief named Span, who joined Gussett's band in 1866 after the hanging of his own father for stealing a judge's mule, and who developed a particular reputation for violence against women. Span vanished in the winter of 1871 from a remote log cabin on the north branch of Black Fork Creek between evening and morning. When deputy marshals reached it 4 days later, everything was undisturbed. His coffee pot still on the cold stove, boots standing side by the door, pipe on the table next to a dog-eared newspaper. On the table, placed in the exact geometric center of a square of clean white paper, was a single-filed bone bead, and beneath it, written in a careful schoolroom hand that several readers have called unusually beautiful, the names of 3 women and 2 children. It was later determined that the 5 names corresponded to Carrick plantation people, 3 adult women and 2 young children, sold away in 1861, separated from their families and never heard from again, with Span listed in the surviving bill of sale as the buyer's agent who arranged their transport south. The 3rd, 4th, and 5th of the 7 fell in quick succession across the summer and autumn of 1872, in circumstances I will not detail here fully, except to note that, in each case a filed bone bead was left where the body should have been, that in each case the man had confessed to some priest, friend, or drinking companion that he had been present at the Carrick plantation during a specific, documented act of cruelty committed against Hester's mother, whose name in the Carrick inventory of 1854 was recorded as Temp, and that in each case, the trail of the missing man, followed by deputy marshals for days, simply ended at a riverbank or sinkhole or cotton field edge, as if the man had walked into the ground and the ground had politely closed over him. By early spring 1873, the 2 names remaining on Hester's bone cord were Abner Gussett himself and a man about whom, I must warn you, the surviving records are so fragmentary, so deliberately redacted, so carefully and institutionally broken, that we cannot even be entirely certain of his real name. The court clerk, whose private letters to his wife surfaced in the spring of 1962, when his grandson opened a locked trunk in a Van Buren attic, refers to the 7th man in a letter written in the early summer of 1873 as simply, "the man we do not speak of." He notes in that same letter, with considerable unease, that the marshal's office in Fort Smith had received that June a direct instruction from Washington, delivered in person by a senior official of the Department of the Interior, who had traveled specifically for this purpose, not to issue any warrant under any name for any fugitive associated with a certain federal property in the Indian Territory. He does not name the property or the fugitive. He notes only that the instruction troubled him greatly, that he lost sleep over it for weeks, and that in his private view, the instruction had come because someone in Washington, someone high enough to send an interior official on a special train across 3 states, was of what a certain colored female tracker would find if she continued riding in the direction she was already known to be heading. The court clerk's name was Thaddeus Buell. Born in Vermont, educated at a small Presbyterian college in Ohio, he came to Fort Smith after the war. His letters to his wife, who stayed in Ohio during his first 3 years because of ill health, are the single most important primary source on the last phase of Hester's life, and the source that the Arkansas Historical Society, meeting twice in the autumn of 1962, voted by majority not to publish. If you're finding this story as unsettling as I am, take a moment to hit the like button below. It genuinely helps these forgotten American stories reach people who might never otherwise hear them, and it tells me to keep digging through the archives for more. If you have a theory about who the seventh man was, or what the Washington instruction was protecting, drop it in the comments. I read every one. Now let me tell you what happened next, because this is where the story stops being a hunt and becomes something considerably darker, where the records themselves begin to behave strangely, going missing, coming back, being replaced with other records that say different things. In the high summer of 1873, Hester went silent for 4 months. There are no payments to Isham Folsom in the Fort Smith ledger from June through September. No sightings on the Choctaw roads. No reports of her passage at the Arkansas River ferries, where ferrymen had previously tracked her with some consistency. No whispered rumors at trading posts in Mallister, Atoka, or Eufaula. She simply disappeared. The silence ended on October 14, 1873, when a Creek Nation light horseman named Pleasant Porter, then 23, later principal chief of the Creek Nation in 1899, rode into Fort Smith with a sealed dispatch for the federal marshal. The dispatch reported that a white man answering Abner Gossett's description had been found 3 days earlier in an abandoned line shack on the North Fork of the Canadian River, about 40 miles west of Eufaula. He was alive, bound to a wooden chair with leather straps cut from a saddle, with a square of paper pinned to his shirt by a sewing needle, on which was written in the same careful schoolroom hand 3 words, preserved exactly in Porter's dispatch. Not him alone. Beneath the words was a sketch of a bone bid, and the bead in the sketch had not been filed smooth. Abner Gossett was brought to Fort Smith under heavy guard, tried before Judge Isaac Parker in mid-November 1873 on 6 counts of murder committed during and after the war, convicted on 4, sentenced to hang, and hanged on February 7, 1874, at 11 in the morning on the Great Gallows in the federal jail courtyard, before a crowd of roughly 800. In his final statement from the scaffold, recorded by the Fort Smith elevator and printed the next morning, Gossett did not confess, beg, pray, or ask forgiveness, he said. And the reporter's shorthand preserves this exactly. She should have killed me herself, and she will never forgive herself that she did not. And the man she is still looking for is a worse man than I ever was. And you will never hang him, and you will never even write his name down, because the people who own him own you too. Those were his last words. The hangman released the trapdoor. The crowd went home. And Hester, wherever she was that morning, began the final hunt of her life. The hunt that would consume the last 15 months of her work, take her across 3 states, and bring her at the end to something she had not expected to find. And that we, reading the records 150 years later, are forced to confront as the thing the Arkansas Historical Society could not bring itself to publish. The 7th name on Hester's cord was not a name at all. It was a title. The title, in the surviving margin notes of Thaddeus Buell to his own copies of the court ledger, was Indian Agent. Specifically, the federal Indian agent assigned to a particular agency within the Indian Territory between 1855 and 1861. A man whose official duties had included distributing annuity payments to one of the 5 tribes, licensing white traders, and most importantly for this story, regulating slavery within the agency's jurisdiction. This last duty existed because at that date the 5 tribes were themselves, in federal law, sovereign slave-holding nations, and the agent's role included the official return of runaway slaves who crossed into the territory from the United States to their legal owners east of the Arkansas River. The agency was a real place with real buildings, employees, account books. It still exists as an archaeological site on federal land. Though the original buildings are gone, the agent was also a real man. His name appears in the Department of the Interior appointment rolls for 1855 and in the termination rolls for 1861, when he resigned for reasons described as personal. I have chosen, after consulting with a living descendant of one of the families involved, not to put his full name in this video, because there are still people alive today who bear his name and blood, who had no part in what I am about to describe. What matters is not his name, but what he had done, according to the reconstruction assembled in the autumn of 1962 by Silas Fry, a retired schoolteacher from Fort Smith who spent 3 years reading Thaddeus Buell's letters and referencing them with federal records and plantation purchase ledgers. The agent had run a private business alongside his federal position between 1855 and 1861. He used his official powers to identify runaway slaves from southern states who reached the Indian Territory, captured them with the help of 4 or 5 hired men within his agency, and sold them, not back to their original owners, which would have required paperwork and attention, but to new slaveholders in Texas and Arkansas at substantial personal profit that he pocketed directly, never recorded in any official ledger. The business was illegal under both federal and tribal law, but because of the territory's geography and the near absence of federal oversight, it was invisible to anyone outside the 4 or 5 men involved. Silas Fry, working slowly through 13 boxes of agency records, transferred to the Federal Archives in 1861, and never examined by any historian in the intervening century, identified by name at least 34 individuals who had passed through the agent's private pipeline in those 6 years. 29 of the names were fully recoverable. One of them, on a bill of sale dated November 17, 1854, was Temp, the same Temp who appeared in the Carrick Plantation inventory of January 1855 as a recent purchase from an Indian agency in the Creek Nation, listed by age, height, and a birthmark on her left shoulder. The same Temp who gave birth 9 months later to a girl named Hester. The same Temp who died at Carrick in the late spring of 1858 under circumstances the plantation recorded as fever, but that the WPA narratives collected 79 years later from 3 witnesses describe in terms no serious historian has treated as fever. Hester had not known. This is the piece that strikes hardest, and the hardest to write about calmly. The fragmentary records suggest that Hester had believed throughout her life, from earliest childhood until the late summer of 1873, when she was already 33, that her mother had been born at Carrick, lived her whole life there, died there, and had never seen any other ground. What Hester learned in the late summer of 1873, and what caused her to go silent for those 4 unaccounted months, was that her mother had once briefly been free. Temp was born into slavery on a cotton plantation in Monroe County, Alabama in 1834. She escaped at 19 in the early spring of 1853, walking west for 41 nights across Mississippi, Louisiana, and the eastern edge of Texas. She made it to the Creek Nation in the late summer of that year. She was alive, free, and safe in the Indian Territory for 10 full months. Then, in early autumn 1854, a federal Indian agent hunted her down inside a Creek freedman's cabin where she had taken shelter, put her in a wagon at gunpoint with 3 other captured runaways, drove 180 miles to a plantation landing on the Yazoo River, and sold her to Thomas Carrick for $450 in gold coin. 9 months later, she gave birth at Carrick to a daughter she named, in a moment no one on the plantation understood at the time, Hester, which in some traditions is a name given to children who are hoped for and waited for, carried a long way before they arrive. 4 years later, in the spring of 1858, she was dead. The man who had sold her was still alive in the late summer of 1873, living comfortably on a federal pension, under his own name in a small town in eastern Arkansas, under explicit protection of the instruction from Washington that Thaddeus Buell noted with such unease. Hester, having learned his name from sources the records do not preserve, rode east out of the Indian Territory toward that town to find him. She found him in December. We know this because Dr. Josiah Alden, a Fort Smith physician whose casebook survives in the University of Arkansas Library, recorded that on December 17, he was summoned to a boarding house on the Van Buren Road to attend a white man suffering from a gunshot wound to the lower abdomen, consistent with a Remington Army revolver fired at close range. The doctor also described a second wound that he declined to detail, writing only that it was a ritual mutilation so distressing and deliberate that he would not commit it to writing. The man died on December 19 after 2 days of what the doctor called the most protracted suffering he had witnessed in his 28 years of practice. Throughout the entry, the doctor does not record the man's name, because, as he notes, a sheriff's deputy had instructed him not to, and later returned to take possession of the body. The boarding house register for that week had its relevant page torn out, but the doctor did record in a margin note, written weeks later, that on the second morning, beside the dying man's bed, he saw a single filed bone bead, and beside it, a square of paper with one word, Temp. Hester was not arrested. No warrant was ever sworn for the death of the man on the Van Buren Road, because officially the man had not died, not been there, not existed in the territory or Arkansas since his 1861 resignation. The Washington instruction had done its work. But Hester did not return to the territory, to Isham Folsom, to the Fort Smith court. She never fired another weapon at anyone for the rest of her life. What she did do, according to the last document that mentions her by any name, was buy a piece of land, 80 acres of cut, over timber country in western Arkansas, about 30 miles northwest of Fort Smith, recorded in the county deed book on March 11, 1875, under the name Hester Alden. She borrowed the surname from the doctor who had treated her mother's killer and had become, from a single surviving letter, her unlikely friend. She paid $160 cash. She built a small 2-room frame house with a stone chimney and a good well, planted an orchard of Arkansas's black apple trees, kept bees, sold honey at the Saturday market. The 1880 census records her as a widow black, about 40, farmer, living alone, unable to read or write, which was not true, but what she told the census taker. After 1880, the trail goes cold. No death record, no grave marker, no will. The land passed before 1900 to a small black Methodist church, held as a burial ground for black Civil War veterans and their families. Still standing today, with the orchard still bearing fruit each autumn. Whether Hester is buried there under another name or no name, or walked into the woods and kept walking, we do not know. The cotton sack and the Sharp's carbine plowed up in 1878 have been identified as the weapon issued to a Union cavalry scout, attached to Captain Hale's detachment. The 11 names in the sack correspond to known fugitives. 9 to men killed or captured by Nani, 1 to the man on the Van Buren Road, and the 11th to no one ever identified. The stitching around that 11th name is noticeably different, tighter, more recent. A different shade of thread. Some researchers argue it was added later, representing a person Hester was still hunting at the end, never found. Others argue the 11th name is one she gave herself. The name of the woman she had become, forced to become, to do what the government refused. On that reading, she added her own name last, understanding she had been hunting one more person all along herself. Which reading is correct? We don't know. The rifle itself vanished after being cataloged at the National Archives and marked for disposal in 1924. It appears in no subsequent inventory. And then, just when we think we've reached the end, the horror deepens in one final unexpected direction. The detail that made the Arkansas Historical Society close the file in 1962 and keep it closed for 4 years was not about Hester. It was about the agent. Silas Fry tracked down a living descendant of the agent's family, a woman in her late 60s, his great-granddaughter, a retired schoolteacher, in a small white frame house in southern Arkansas. He wrote to her, explained his research in general terms, asked if any family papers survived. She wrote back within a week there was a trunk in the attic, unopened since the agent's death in 1893. Fry came to open it. They spent an afternoon in the overheated attic, going through photographs, deeds, personal letters, a family Bible. At the bottom, wrapped in a yellowed pillowcase, was a small cloth bag stitched shut with black thread. The elderly woman recalled her mother telling her as a girl never to open it. Fry asked permission. She hesitated, asked if it mattered. He said it did. She gave permission. He cut the stitches. Inside the bag, separated by tissue paper to prevent tangling, were 14 locks of human hair, each tied with a different colored silk ribbon, pinned to labeled tissue paper in the agent's handwriting with a first name and a date. From April 1855 to August 1861, he had kept them for 32 years. The 13th name, tied with black ribbon, dated November 17, 1854, 2 months before the sale to Carrick, was Temp. The elderly great-granddaughter had not known any of it. She sat for several minutes without speaking. She asked to be alone. When Fry returned 3 hours later, the bag was empty. She had taken the locks to a small black Methodist cemetery in a shallow valley in western Arkansas. She knew of it from a county history pamphlet, with old apple trees growing along its eastern edge. She had gone alone with a garden trowel, asked the groundskeeper to bury something small, and buried the 14 locks under 14 flat stones from the creek bed, and asked forgiveness in the name of a great-grandfather she had never met and a woman whose name she had learned that afternoon. Silas Fry wrote it all down that night in his hotel room. It remains in his papers, left behind when he died in 1978, the papers the Arkansas Historical Society twice voted not to publish. They felt it was not their place to decide whether Hester had forgiven the agent. They did not feel they had the moral authority to assert the matter was closed or open, or had any conclusion beyond the one a private woman had attempted to grant on behalf of another. And so the file remains closed, in a locked cabinet in Little Rock, in the sealed dossier of a dead amateur historian. The records do not, and probably never will, tell us whether Hester herself ever knew about the locks of hair. Whether she knew at the end that her mother had been kept by her killer as a ribboned relic for 20 years after her death, whether on some cold night in 1890 or 91 or 92, she sat on her porch and understood at last that the thing she had been hunting for 25 years had not been men. Not a list of names stitched in rust, colored thread on a cotton sack, but a single unbearable fact about the country she was born into and the century she lived through. That her hunt ended not because the names were crossed off, but because the hunter finally understood what she had been hunting. We do not know. We cannot know. We can only guess. And the guess carries the weight of every person whose name never made a ledger, whose hair was never kept, whose child never learned her mother had once, for 10 short months in a Creek freedman's cabin in the autumn of 1853, been free. This story shows us something about our country that official histories do not like to plainly tell, that justice, when denied by law and government, is sometimes taken up in secret by those law and government have abandoned. And when taken up that way, it cannot be called justice in any clean sense, but cannot be called anything else either. It shows us the line between hunter and hunted is not always a moral one, and sometimes the only people who can cross it with clarity are those who have crossed it once before. It shows us that a woman written down in 1860 as a 400 of property could, within a decade, make the most feared outlaws on the American frontier bury their weapons and run at the sound of her name. And above all, it shows us that when we are told records are lost, or a story cannot be confirmed, or a file closed for historical delicacy, we should ask who had the power to decide what was recorded and what was lost, and who has benefited from the forgetting. What do you think? Do you believe Hester was a murderer, a soldier, a judge, a prophet, or something our language has no clean word for? Was the Arkansas Historical Society right to keep the file closed? Or should the agent's name be published at last, 150 years later, to finally balance the ledger? Leave a comment. I read every one, and I argue with some. If this story moved you, subscribe, hit the bell, and share it with someone who believes the dead still have claims on us. I'll see you in the next video.